good to see you all here on the Friday afternoon with somewhat sunny weather in Amsterdam. I'm so glad to have Ayhan Kaya here today for a lecture we have organized on Nativist and Islamist radicalism in Europe, co-radicalisation of young Europeans. As I already said, we're very pleased to have Ayhan Kaya visiting us, Professor of Politics and Jean Monnet Chair of European Politics of Interculturalism at the Bilgi University in Istanbul. And the lecture that you will be hearing this evening is actually one of a series that we are organizing by the research network ValEUs. So it's a bigger project we present here to you. It's a network which involves 20 partner institutions from 17 countries across 5 continents. And it focuses on scrutinizing, in a larger sense, the foreign policy of the European Union, the challenges posed to its values, and to explore potential counter-strategies to this. What is central to the network is a shared urge to further examine whether the European Union adheres to the values it prescribes for itself. And central in this research is to examine how the European Union responds to the several challenges it faces, such as rising inequalities, populist movements, climate change, but also geopolitical struggle. To what extent does the European Union manage to uphold its values, such as human dignity, freedom, equality, solidarity, amidst such challenges? And today, with Ayhan, we focus on one of those challenges in Europe, namely Nativist and Islamist radicalism in Europe. I'm very pleased that Ayhan Kaya is here to provide us with insights in this topic, which has been at the heart of his work for a long time, I would say, but particularly in the research project presented today. Without saying too much right now, as Ayhan will provide you with all the details in his lecture as well, I wanted to highlight a few things already to get a bit of an idea of the direction that we will go in this particular session that we're going to have, to provide you with an idea of the topics that I think are at the heart of what we talk about today. The main question, and Ayhan will probably repeat that is in his lecture as well, that Ayhan and his team tried to answer in the recent research project has been how and why do some European citizens generate a radical populist and Islamophobist discourse to express their discontent regarding the current social, economic, and political state of their national or European context? And while do some members of migrant origin communities with a Muslim background generate an essentialist and radical form of Islamist discourse in the same societies? They seem to happen parallelly in the same time at the same geographical space. So how can we explain that? So what Ayhan Kaya has tried to do with his team of researchers has been, first of all, to look at the dynamic between these two groups of youth, which are too often, as has been stated also in the work that you presented, examined separately. So they try to understand the sources of discontent, not only of the populist young native groups, but also the sources of discontent of radical young self-identified Muslims with a migrant background. What might be the relationship between the nativist populist radicalism and Islamic radicalism, and might there actually be a connection between the anxieties experienced by both groups that are present in Europe? And I think that is at the heart of what we focus on today as well. Moreover, central to the research is the insistence that the answers to these questions, why there is such discontent and why does it lead to radicalization, must be found in social, economic, political, and psychological drivers behind radicalization. And as such, the research really calls for a move away from ethno-national and religious explanations, which have dominated much of the scholarship thus far. So this is, I think, important to keep in mind. Finally, I think, which is quite central to the work that we will hear more about today, is that Ayhan and his team have emphasized that there is a need to move away from the use of radicalism as interchangeably with extremism, terrorism, fundamentalism, and violence. Instead, it's quite crucial to really focus on radicalism as a quest for the democratization of democracies. These considerations, which are central to Ayhan's recent work, are, I think, extremely valuable, and particularly in these times in which we see an increasing polarization fragmentation amongst communities in Europe. And some have argued that this has led to a decrease of ownership and belonging, which negatively affects democratization processes. And this is, and I would say in particularly if we focus on youth, a rather worrying development. If the explanation of these processes of radicalism can indeed be found in social, economic, political, and psychological marginalization experienced by this youth, what can we actually learn from that? And how do we respond to that? So today's session will hopefully provide you with some more insights in this. Ayhan can say much more about this than I just presented, but I wanted to give an idea of the gist of what we'll look at today. And I don't think we might find solutions, but at least I think it will be important to ask these critical questions and to look at the research and what that has shown us in the European context. So we will start this session with a lecture of Ayhan. That will be followed by a response from Gulnaz Sipkotalina, who is already here as well, who is an assistant professor for illiberal regimes at the Department of History, European Studies and Religious Studies at the University of Amsterdam. And her research focuses on Islam in Europe as well, and contemporary Islamic thought, which make her an excellent respondent, I would say, in what we're going to do today. After the lecture, of course, the discussion will be opened for the audience, and I will make sure that there's plenty of room for that. But of course, we will first invite Ayhan on stage to give us all the insight about this topic.
Thank you very much, Klaske, for this excellent summary. First of all, and of course for the invitation. This is a great honor to be here. Actually, I was going to speak here just before the pandemic officially started in 2020, and I had to immediately leave the country because the pandemic was coming. So this meeting here had to be cancelled, and now I can make it. So I'm very happy to be in Amsterdam, to be with the colleagues. Can I just go through the slides? Yeah? Yeah. So this is a research which was recently completed, which lasted for 5 years. And for almost more than 2 decades, I've been working on Islam in Europe, Turkish origin, Moroccan origin, young people in Europe. But also over the last 10 years, I've been looking at the right-wing nationalist and populist groups across the European countries. There are going to be 4 countries I will specifically focus on: Germany, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But I will talk through some local aspects, because as a social scientist, I always argue that everything that we go through is local. Radicalism is local, populism is local, Islamism is local, nationalism is local. I mean, the things that we will talk about Amsterdam will be, of course, automatically different from the things that we will talk about Rotterdam or the Bible Belt. From time to time, you will hear Bible Belt, coming out, popping out very often. So I will try to introduce this notion of co-radicalisation. I'm a scholar trying to be critical on the prevalence of the civilizational discourse, Huntingtonian civilizational discourse, which is a discourse that is dividing us, that is dividing the societies, that is dividing the societies, fragmenting the societies into bits and pieces. So instead of this Huntingtonian civilizational discourse, I rather try to promote socioeconomic perspectives, political perspectives, and psychological perspectives. I try to underline the socioeconomic, political, geographical, and psychological drivers from all kinds of actions that we're coming across in our everyday life. So recently we have published this book. It's an edited book called Nativist and Islamist Radicalism with the contribution of several different scholars as well as my own research team. So I will first of all put the question which was already put by Klaske. First of all, let me tell you about the term radicalization. For me, there is nothing wrong with the term radical, with the term radicalization. We need that term, something that we have forgotten about, something that is stigmatized for the last 2 decades already, something that is being coupled with or interchangeably being used with extremism, fundamentalism, terrorism. So I'll walk you through the history of the term radicalization and try to explain why we need the term radicalization, why we shouldn't be afraid of the term radicalization, and why the neoliberal forms of governance have injected on us the perspectives to dislike the term radical, to dislike anyone who is radical. So I will argue that there's nothing wrong with the term radical. This speech is a radical speech, but there's nothing wrong with being radical. Being radical for me is being oppositional, being critical, being objective, being critique of the existing neoliberal forms of governmentalities, which are mostly about the celebration of differences, which are mostly about being essentialist, being nativist, being religious, being Islamist. Instead, we need to, as social scientists, we need to find ways to bridge, to reassemble the social, which has been so much fragmented over the last 30 years. So I try to do it for myself, for my students, for the people that I talk to, for the publics that I communicate with. So in that sense, this is a very essential question that I try to work myself. I use the social movements theory to a great extent to have a different perspective about what radicalization is all about, what the radicals are all about. So I'll briefly mention about that in a while. I'm not looking at the violent forms of radicalisms. I'm looking at the non-violent forms of radicalizations, which are actually much more prevalent than all those violent forms of radicalisms, extremisms, and even terrorism. And my question as a social scientist is to challenge the labels, to challenge the frames that are being imposed on individuals by the states, by the political actors, by the media, etc. As a political science scholar, I really try to challenge those frames given. For instance, I always had a problem with the label Muslim in the European context, putting everyone into the same basket as Muslim. I had the same problem with labeling every right-wing, nativist, populist young person within the framework of, within the label of far-right extremists, neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, etc., etc. So these are the labels which are actually inflicted upon us by the state actors, by the political party actors. Of course, there is no problem naming a political party as being racist, as being fascist, as being neo-Nazi. But I want to offer an idea that we need to really make a differentiation between the people supporting these parties and between those organized political parties using or instrumentalizing the fears, spatial, economic, political, geographical fears of these people. So this is something that I also want to highlight. And this is something that we talked about already. And focusing on similarities rather than differences is a key challenge that we are all actually exposed to. So I would argue that my position as a social scientist, as a scholar, would be a postmodern positionality, critiquing this postmodernist discourse in so many different ways, although I know it has really liberated us in so many different ways, but I think we have really come to the end of that rhetoric, of that endist ideology, end of ideologies, end of modernity, end of history, and these are all, I think, for me, they all sound very neoliberal in a way. So I'm not going to go into the research design that much, but please let me tell you that 4 countries are there in the picture: Germany, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And in those 4 countries, we have interviewed quite a number of people, more than 300 people, half and half self-identified Muslims and right-wing populist young people. We have interviewed the self-identified Muslims in big cities: Amsterdam, Berlin, Cologne, Paris, and Brussels. And the nativist right-wing young people between the age of 18 and 30, we have interviewed them in the so-called remote places, not only spatially or geographically remote places, but also politically and ideologically remote places, the industrialized places, or the places where there was rural production, but lately those places which are being neglected, which are being left behind. So meaning that, Lyon in France, for instance, Toulon in France, or Dresden in Germany, Brandenburg in Germany, Aalst in Belgium, and Rotterdam, and some Bible Belt cities in the Netherlands. So these localities are very important, and we had different strategies to reach out these people. We had native researchers, PhD students, conducting the research in those countries, and it was much easier to reach out to the self-identified Muslim youngsters rather than the nativist young people, because there was always a problem in reaching out the young nativist people. So this is just the gender elements of our sample. The right-wing nativist scenery is more male-dominant, so the number of the females is less than the male interlocutors. But among the self-identified Muslims, we picked up almost equal number of men and women. I keep saying self-identified because I think it is important, because when you look at the European public in general, all those migrant origin people coming from Muslim-dominant countries are labeled as simply Muslims. You know, they could put me in that basket. They could put liberals, seculars, everyone in that basket, without asking anyone how they could identify, they would identify themselves primarily. And it's always interesting for me. I remember just a few years ago, I was involved in a workshop project organized by Joschka Fischer for the Council of Ministers. And then there was this Turkish origin young woman lawyer from the Netherlands. Her story is always very striking for me. I listened to her, and then that's what she was saying. She was saying that I came to the Netherlands in the 1970s as a daughter of a very secular, very Kemalist family, right? But then, during the coming years, I was Islamized, and this person was with headscarf, with conservative, background, with conservative stance. So this Islamization that we are talking about in the European context, for the last 20 years, I've been working on that as well, quite extensively. And I think it is also something to do with the European states' ways of accommodating Islam in the European countries. So if you, as the European states, delegate all the issues of faith to the home governments, to the home states, then of course the home states, like the Turkish state, like the Moroccan state, will be immediately eager to to reach out to their members of the diaspora using more religion, using more Islam. So this is something that has something to do with the European context. That is, there is a very intriguing problem of the accommodation of Islam in the European countries. So I've written on that quite extensively, but I'm not going to go into detail. So this research lasted for 5 years. And so let me just say a few words about the term radical. If you look at the social movements theory, Craig Calhoun is one of them, one of the pivotal figures in social movements theory. He tells us that there may be different kinds of radicalisms: philosophical radicalism, tactical radicalism, and reactionary radicalism. Marx was a radical. Martin Luther was a radical. Comte was a radical. So they were the radicals of their age, right? So there is nothing wrong in this sense. Democrats were the radicals of the 19th century. Socialists were the radicals of the 19th century. The young 1968 generation were the radicals of their own generation. And the radicals, I'm staying in Casa Hotel. I can see the pictures of those radicals as well in Hotel Casa Amsterdam. So there's nothing wrong with the term radical. But then, of course, recently it has been framed in a very different way by all these different kinds of neoliberal forms of governmentalities. Tactical radicalism, if there is a bit of violence in it, revolutions are tactically radical. Yellow Vest movement was a tactically radical movement. So then post-colonial movement was a tactically radical movement, according to Craig Calhoun. For me, what is important is this reactionary form of radicalism. I frame nativist, Islamist forms of radicalisms in this frame because these are the young people who are resenting, who are growing this kind of ressentiment against ongoing problems of socioeconomic deprivation, spatial geographical deprivation, psychological deprivation, political deprivation. So they're trying to relocate themselves against the destabilizing effects of modernization and globalization. So that is why we have conducted all these interviews. And all these interviews, although it was difficult to reach out to these people, I had a special section at the end of each interview asking my researchers to write up their own observations. Across the board, all these young people who are named as fascists or neo-Nazis, or they were very happy to be interviewed. They were very happy to be listened to. I think that is the problem. You know, we don't know how to listen, although they really continue talk about their different forms of deprivation. But then what makes them different is the ways in which they respond to these, to these destabilizing factors of globalization and modernization. They have their own separate cultural repertoires. Some are using more Islamist elements. Some are using more nationalist and nativist elements. So we respond to the problems using our own cultural political repertoire. We are not really that different actually from these people. We also have our own communities. They have their ethno-national and religious communities. We have our own probably Twitter communities, epistemic communities, Facebook communities, Instagram communities. So we are all living in our own bubbles, in our own communities. So we are not really that different from these people that we are mostly very critical about. So let's face the truth, right? Human beings do not really change that much. And we're not really that different from the people who lived 2,000 years ago. I always remember Socrates complaining about the young generations. We do the same, right? So we don't really, anthropologically speaking, we don't really change that easily, right? But these people are framed as radical extremists because of the tools that they have in their repertoires. We are mostly talking about rather less educated people. We are talking about rather less mobile people, but they are not really fancying being less educated, being less mobile. They're actually not really globalism. They are not really actually anti, let's say, mobility. They are not anti-Erasmus program. But this is, you know, the term ressentiment plays a very important role here. They have this ressentiment because it is the fox and grape problem. We try to belittle the things that we really long for, but we cannot reach. Because liberal system, democratic system, is always teaching us that we are all equal. We are all free. We are all, we can all access to all these rights. But in reality, we know that we cannot. In reality, those people know that they cannot. So this causes a resentment. This causes a ressentiment. So we need to really decipher. We really need to decode the feelings of ressentiment rather nicely, right? So just coming towards the mid of the presentation. So co-radicalization here, we have detected the statistical data as well. Since 9/11, we have seen a very clear pattern of co-radicalization of these two groups of people, Nativist and Islamist, becoming really, or going really very different paths, hating each other, radicalizing in their own ways. So the term co-radicalization we pick up from the psychology department, psychology literature, and I find it very useful to really tell us what we have been looking at. So we are looking at a group of people. They are all European citizens, born and raised in this geography. They all go through socioeconomic deprivation, political deprivation, nostalgic deprivation, spatial deprivation, epistemic injustice, and all these emotions such as resentment, anger, fear, etc., right? So what we are saying is that these communities are actually quite identical because of the similarity of all these different forms of deprivation that they go through. Just a bit of theory here before we go into the statements of these young people, which show that they are actually quite identical in so many different ways. I look at this ultra-politics and sub-politics because political institutions no longer function. I can see in the Netherlands as well. Democratic institutions are no longer functioning because they're not democratic enough. They are not liberal enough. So Schmidt has already told us back in the 1930s, if the democratic institutions, parliamentary regime is not really working out, then this proper politics is replaced with ultra politics, which is rather more polarizing, which is rather more right-wing, populist, and fragmenting. So we are going through a kind of ultra politics at the moment. So when the proper politics is not working, when the parliamentary democracy is not working, then individuals create their own tactics, create their own fugitive power, or their own unconventional forms of doing politics. So they do politics on the street, they do politics in class, they do politics on campus. So this is what I observe, and I also put the young people becoming radical within this framework, and I think they're also generating their own tactics according to, let's say, Michel Desserteau, or fugitive power according to Robin Cohen, or they create their own sub-politics or their own life politics according to Habermas. So we don't really need so many different theories to really try to explain the rationale of these people becoming more and more radical. I think classical texts are still very pivotal there to really teach us to understand the main drivers behind these people. So just a few tropes that we have encountered very much among the young nativist people. I use the term Islamophobism rather than Islamophobia because I think it's better to use Islamophobism. I can tell you more about that in the question and answer session. We come across those nativists in those places, deindustrialized places, very often. Those places which are called being left behind. The youngsters with the nativist stance have constantly talked about experiencing stigmatization in everyday life, named as like neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, etc. And they try to tell us that no, they are not. They're just not being hurt. And this Muslim invasion of Europe is also a very common trope that we have encountered. In the literature, you also know that great replacement theory by Renaud Camus from France. And the term Eurabia also, I think, is being used by Wilders very often. So these are the fears that are being very effective on the young people. So nostalgic deprivation is another term that I use very much from heritage studies I borrow. And I think it's also very explanatory, because if the current state of mind is so destabilizing, if the present is so troubling, then we don't really want to think about the future anymore. So what really comes more handy is to appeal ourselves to the past, to heroisms, to heritage, to all these nice stories that are often circulated by, through the soap operas. For instance, in Turkey, you keep having these neo-Ottoman movies, or you keep hearing from Le Pen the stories about Jeanne d'Arc, or from the UKIP guys, Queen Boudica, etc., etc. So the heritage becomes very instrumental, the past becomes very instrumental for these organized political parties to really use to mainstream their positions. For the self-identified Muslims, we have here again a kind of nostalgic deprivation, and how they try to respond to this deprivation. They try to become better Muslims, better human beings, by appealing to the stories of Prophet Muhammad. They become more, in that sense, into the stories of Quran. I think what is really striking compared to the 2000s, I remember the research that I did in 2000s and the research that I did now, there was a big difference among the young people. I can tell you many stories from the Dutch case in the 2000s. In the 2000s, self-identified young Muslims were not going to the mosques. They were not meeting imams. They were not happy with what their parents were teaching to them in the name of Islam. They were not happy with the teachings of imams. They were not happy with the teachings of the mosques. They had their own teaching methods, learning methods through Google, being virtual alims, virtual Muslims, translating Quran to their own language, whatever it is. So they were really creating their own interpretation of what the Quran. So they were actually liberalizing religion. They were actually liberalizing Islam. But over the last 10 years, the case is no longer the same. Over the last 10 years, I think because of the lack of political and economic opportunity structures, which were not created by the home states here in this European context, the migrant sending countries have offered their own political opportunity structures to really mobilize their own diasporic individuals. So now the young generations are going more to the mosques. They are becoming more affiliated with the teachings of imams. So I think there is a kind of here resurgence of a stronger organized Islamist kind of stance. This is really an interesting point. And in this slide, let me just underline one of the things that one of our colleagues is underlining. Many people talk about radicalization of Islam, but Olivier Rouaille has a different stance on this question. He argues that Islam is not becoming radicalized, but actually radicalism is becoming Islamized. I think the question here is the lack of left-wing political discourses. The question here is the absence of left-wing counter-hegemonic ideologies. Socialism gone, communism gone, utopia is gone. So in the absence of these counter-hegemonic left-wing ideologies, there is a vacuum. And this vacuum is being filled by the nationalist populist on the one hand, by Islamists on the other hand. So we need the left. We need the left-wing counter-hegemonic ideologies. And I tell you, if we were back in the 1960s, most probably these young people who are nowadays becoming co-radicalized, they would set up an alliance in Gramscian sense to fight back against the state that they are not happy with at all. So this is the kind of thing that we are going through. This is the prevalence of the civilizational rhetoric, which is really dividing us between us and them in a way. So coming to the, because the time is, please let me know when we have to end. So just some similarities. We have asked 4 different sets of questions about their private life, their everyday life, their thoughts about their communities, neighborhoods, about Europe, about world, and about the future. And then we have seen that they are truly identical in so many different ways. Instead of differences, what we have observed is that they have similar stances on mobility, on educational experiences, on the parents' backgrounds. This is the question that we asked to the self-identified Muslims. But self-identified Muslims talked more about discrimination in everyday life, about their headscarf, about their religion, about their names being discriminated when they apply for jobs, etc., etc. The same question when we asked to the native young people, we have seen the same in mobility. They're not mobile either, and they have similar educational experiences, problems. They have parents. Most of the young people with the nativist stance, they had divorced family situations, separated parents' situation. So they really constantly talk about their own problems in the family. So these are really important psychological parameters that we need to take into consideration. What made them different, they talked more about family problems, they talked more about economic issues, economic problems, and they talked about their organizations, because nativist young people are more organized, more appealed to these organized right-wing populist political parties. Wilders here, AfD in Germany, Le Pen in France, and Vlaams Blok in Belgium. So limited mobility, a common denominator, but that doesn't mean that they're anti-mobility. As I told you, they long for becoming like every one of us, being more mobile, but they cannot. So then they express their hostility against this mobility, against Erasmus, against student exchange, etc., etc. Both groups are not really happy about current state of politics. They want more democracy. They want more direct democracy. And they are both critical about the current state of the refugee issue, migration issue. So in Turkish, we've got a saying, guests do not appreciate the other guests, hosts do not appreciate either. So these young people, self-identified young people with Muslim background, with migration background, they are also similarly critical of the current state of the migration and refugee phenomena in the European Union. There is a bit of difference here, but not really that much difference. Self-identified Muslims constantly talk about discrimination intersectional discrimination, especially among the young women. Natives talked about constantly stigmatization, right? And they are quite, it's also interesting for us, for me, they are actually quite into civic identities, civic duties. So they are in favor of voting, but they are becoming more and more skeptical about the political parties, but they are actually trying to become, you know, really fine with this right to vote. So they're not really into that much street protests and everything. They want to become more civic in that sense. In terms of globalization, they have a bit of difference there as well, since they are different. So just some quotations I'll just walk you through very briefly. Self-identified Muslim 24-year-old Turkish origin woman in Berlin, talking about these communities, these talks that she's exposed to in her own religious community, in her own tariqat. So they need these communities to relocate themselves against the destabilizing effects of globalization, against the destabilizing effects of ongoing politics. They are afraid of extremism, they are afraid of Islamophobism. So it's a kind of quest for community for these young people to be within the parameters of these religious communities. We looked at the Turkish origin young people and the Moroccan origin young people, and then we have seen that they are very much appealed to the official Islamist ideology imposed by their own sending states, Turkey and Morocco. For instance, Moroccans are much more into Islam of the middle, as they say. It's more Sufi kind of Islam. But the Turkish origin young people, they are more exposed to Sunni version of Islam, which has become recently more and more Wahhabi because of the Justice and Development Party in Turkey. So apparently these countries, the migrant sending countries, origin countries, are becoming more and more impactful on their diasporic communities. And I talked about this. We have seen many young people who make a differentiation between culture and religion, and they argue that religion is a source of emancipation, but culture is really a source of kind of repression from their parents, from their sending states, etc. They are all reflexive individuals in a way. Dresden is a really interesting, Dresden has always been puzzling for me. That is the place where Pegida was born. That's the place AfD gets like more than 30%. That's the place Islamophobia or Islamophobism is so prevalent. But that's the place where you don't see Muslims in everyday life, because there is not. So how come there is this strong Islamophobia in a place where there are no Muslims in everyday life? I guess the answer is easy. It's all because of the framing of Islam through the media, in the media, right? But I think there is one thing more. There is one more thing. These young people in Dresden, they are not happy with the current socioeconomic situation, political situation. They are not happy with the empty promises given by the Kohl administration to their parents back in the 1990s. There is still relative deprivation in Dresden, in East German provinces, former East German provinces, and there is a kind of internal colonialism that they are not happy with. Around like 60% of the high-ranking positions in former East German provinces are taken by people coming from West Germany, scholars, doctors, NGO people, etc. So then I go back to my readings of Michael Hechter back in the 1970s about Irish case in the UK, internal colonialism. He coined the term, and I think there is an internal colonialism in East German provinces. But then they don't really express this problem using socioeconomic discourse, because they know that Merkel or Berlin will not really hear what they say if they talk about their socioeconomic relative deprivation. But when they become Islamophobic, when they use the Islamophobic discourse, then all of a sudden we're all going to concentrate, we're all going to focus on what they do, what they say. I think this is a tactic again, going back to the former frame that I tried to offer to you. This is a tactic. And then when I was doing research in Dresden, I realized that, well, they're actually quite atheist, quite agnostic, and they have a problem with religion. So not particularly with Islam, but this, this Islamophobic discourse is something that needs to be also analyzed rather more carefully. So in France, we have met this constantly repeated trope. We are lagging behind Germany. So there is really this interesting asymmetrical relationship between Germany and France. We have seen this, anecdote several times in many interviews. They constantly complain about the fact that they are lagging behind Germany. They need to catch up with Germany. This is from the Netherlands. I mean, you are more familiar with me about the individuals, the young people in the Bible Belt. In Rotterdam, Rotterdam, I remember, was, I think, the biggest port in Europe, right, for so many decades. But now there is more deindustrialization, there is more inequality, there is more unemployment, and the same goes with the Bible Belt places which we have conducted our interviews in. And I think there is a problem there in terms of losing their homogeneity, losing their home that they knew the best, and this is a kind of creating resentment against this diversity, against this unity in diversity discourse from time to time. I've also come across in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, on the buildings' facades, which was fun. So there is a problem with this unity in diversity, which needs to be really taken care by the European Union, because it creates fear, it creates a kind of resentment among those people who are not really heard of, who are not really listened according to their testimonies, of course. This is a really striking case in Belgium. Aalst, I don't know, Klaske, you've been to Aalst? Aalst is 15 minutes away by train from Brussels. But the moment you get out of the train station, poverty, deindustrialization, and asocial individuals really hit you. And they start complaining about those people coming from Brussels, buying their properties, increasing the rents, increasing the property prices, etc., etc., etc. Then, of course, in such a context, they become more and more Eurosceptic. They become more and more anti-migrant. And these are the places, it's interesting, I mean, they constantly talk about migration, incoming migration, but actually there is another urgent problem which they don't really talk about, but they live in everyday life, because these are the places in which shrinking populations is the biggest problem. So they lose their population, but they cannot really, they don't talk about this aging population, shrinking population. It's better, it's easier, because being anti-migrant, being anti-refugee is the mainstream now in Europe, right? So it's better to be anti-migrant, it's better to be anti-refugee. So these are the things, I mean, there are more slides, but I know my time is gone already. But one of the things really, let me just, since we are now in the Netherlands, I just want to highlight one of the striking differences that we observed in the interviews that we held here in the Netherlands, is that many self-identified Muslim youngsters here are aware of their rights much more than the others in the other contexts, and the mechanisms they can use to seek justice when faced with discrimination. So this shows how democracy is actually internalized by self-identified young Muslims living in this country compared to the others in the other countries. So for among the young, of course, nativists, They are afraid of multicultural, multicultural Netherlands. And then this brings me back to my old readings from the American context, when the right-wingers, like scholars Robert Hugh and Schlesinger, they talked about disuniting America. So disuniting Netherlands, probably it's their biggest fear, and that's why critical of the multicultural stance. So let me just complete this presentation by our suggestion with hashtag lend them your ears. We have compiled all the data in this website, and all the data are also accessible for the researchers in the European Union, European Institute University in Florence. So for the researchers, it is easy, it is free to have access. And here, one of my favorite Turkish poets says, I know 3 things, I will tell them to the one who makes it 4 by listening. We don't know how to listen. I think this is really the thing that we need to improve. We need to know how to listen. Because as Robert Young from the post-colonial literature is also one of my favorites, he says, well, it's not that they do not know how to speak, but rather that the dominant would not listen. So that is the problem. That is the problem. So let me just conclude here. What do we do then, Klaske? We need more community centers. We need more youth centers. We need more cultural centers. We need more sports venues. We need more, third spaces, spaces of encounter, so that these young people can get together, exchange their forms of deprivation, have a dialogue, and in aesthetic forms, let them out. Because in the end of the day, we are talking about adolescent people, young people, who are bound to be radical, who are bound to be anti-anything, anti-something, right? So we need to have channels to really offer them to express their radical stances through aesthetic forms of expression. Lately, I hear this interesting story from Germany. There is this famous song which is being used, appropriated by the nativist young people in the island of the rich in the North Sea. It's in the social media. But then the same song, I mean, in the song they say, Ausländer raus, foreigners out, but the same song is appropriated by the Berliner young people, singing with the same song, Nazis raus, Nazis out. So for me, I think this is fine, because as long as there is music in it, as long as there are cultural, expressive cultures involved, as long as there is art in a way, there are such venues. These forms of radicalisms can be outspoken in more peaceful, peaceful ways. Yeah. So that's why we really need to tackle the neoliberal state formation in a way, and we need to claim more of these spaces, which actually used to be offered by the welfare states in 1990s, in 1980s, very well. So the answer is not really somewhere very far. The answer is already there in our own baggage, in our own repertoire. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayhan. So we now move to the second part of our presentation today, where I've asked Gülnaz to give a first comment to this very interesting lecture, which is also meant to open up for a discussion with the entire audience. So we're going to continue immediately after that. Gülnaz, feel free.
Yes. Thank you so much, Klaske, first of all, for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's really an honor to comment to Ayhan's work. I think I will just give him a minute to join us. So that What I really found important is probably to re-emphasize some of the aspects that Ayhan was talking about, and indeed ask a couple of questions on some of the key terms, so about the paradigm, about the co-radicalisation, and religion as a project that fills in the vacuum left by the left. So I think it's important aspects. So first of all, I think what is probably original indeed about your work is that we are now in what I see as the third phase of dealing with communities that are indeed put together in the basket Muslim. I totally agree that sometimes it's in itself very problematic definition to put together communities that are very, very varied. Because in the 90s, it was indeed mostly about Islam and its relationship with liberalism. So it was about how the two can be combined, and there was projects about European liberal Islam, all attempts to solve the problems through theology. As you say, indeed, that really didn't work out because it wasn't really about Islam, but something else. And then in 2010s, I think there was also about the question about the communities themselves not participating enough, not being interested, not being involved, not speaking the language. So the paradigm has shifted, but still the blame was still quite often put on the communities themselves, sort of lacking some of the steps. So now what I see, we're in the sort of third framework, where it's not really so much about the communities, but about the society, the institutions, the frameworks, indeed the more globalized even structures, as you call, indeed globalization, neoliberalism. And in this regard, your comparison to also nativist communities is very important, because it shows that it's not only communities with Muslim background or migrant background that struggle, but also some of the communities that are local and very much belong to the majority society. So I think in that respect, it is important shift, which you also see in policy making happening, especially for the Netherlands. It will be probably a very familiar case where institutions recognize that some of the systems of discriminations are very much embedded. So think about the child benefit scandal that happened in the Netherlands very recently. And in your last slide, you indeed talk about some of the solutions, what to do. And from what I indeed understand, you would say that you don't need to distinguish between self-defined Muslims or non-Muslims, but try to put them together and try to approach the youth. But at the same time, it seems that the problem is very big, because it's also about changing the systems, and some of the systems are so globalized that even the Netherlands in itself cannot solve. So how do you think about those more radical solutions maybe? Because I know that you did also a lot of policy advice. Do you have some solutions also on the bigger scale, or is it something that cannot be solved? So how would you comment on that?
Gulnaz, thank you very much. These are very important questions. First of all, I also agree that the term Muslim in the European context is an empty signifier. It doesn't really, for me, as someone coming from Turkey, you know, is a Muslim dominant country, looking at the European context, it is an empty signifier. I think we really need to get rid of ethnocultural and religious markers in defining the people that we are interacting with. We need to stick to socioeconomic, political markers that we used to know better in the past. This is one thing. And the other thing is that you talked about the paradigmatic shifts. I think one of the biggest paradigmatic shifts that I have come across was back in the 1970s. 1970s is important for the prevalence of, let's say, for the birth and prevalence of Islamophobist discourse in the European context, which is really strikingly similar to what we have at the moment. We have a war in Gaza, Arab-Israel war there. We used to have a war in 1973, Arab-Israel war, which really created great fault lines which are difficult to tackle over the last 40 years. So what happened in 1970s? In 1970s, something really radical happened. Because the radicals, some of you will remember here, were the left-wing guys, right, or women. RAF was radical. In Italy, there were left radicals. In Latin America, there were left radicals. But in 1970s, something happened, and those left radicals were, in a way, domesticated. They became more moderate. So they were no longer an issue. They were no longer a challenge for the changing neoliberal states. So it was in those days, again, the rapprochement between East and West was witnessed. USSR was no longer the big geographical enemy of Europe, of the West. Instead of USSR, after 1974 oil crisis, the Middle East became the geographical enemy of Europe, of the West, in a way, right? And in the meantime, ideologically speaking, communism ceased to be the enemy of the capitalist West. Instead, Islam replaced that enemy. Since then, Islam is the enemy, right? And then again, we just remember other labelings. For instance, back in the 1960s, the Netherlands also received a lot of workers, recruited a lot of workers. They were simply called workers. Turks, Italians, Greeks, Bosniaks, they were all mobilized through labor unions. They were all together, right? But things happened back in the 1980s and 1990s. Suddenly they were separated as Turks, Kurds, so ethnic framing became more dominant. But after 1990s, especially Iran, and then the war in the Balkans, we started to have all of a sudden Muslims. We put everyone in the same basket, naming them as Muslims. So these paradigmatic shifts have been really, peculiarly important for the state actors, for the European Union actors to try to first understand what is going on and to try to resolve. One of the things, for instance, Trevi Group. Trevi Group is a really interesting group established by the European Commission back in the 1970s to try to understand what this terrorism, radicalization, extremism, violence, and international community. What was it all about? But they were really clever enough to separate all these terms from each other. So they did not use these terms interchangeably. Extremism is something, radicalism is something. So they were really trying to find the root causes of all these different processes. But nowadays, unfortunately, even the European Commission is blinded to put all these things into the same basket, interchangeably using all these terms. The other thing, communities. I think neoliberalism is based on two different pillars. One, prudentialist idea, and the other one is communitarian idea. Because welfare state is no longer there. Welfare state is gone. The neoliberal state is telling us to look after ourselves, to look after our children's private education, right? Private health services, private retirement funds, I don't know what, or having our own houses secured against the burglars, etc., etc. So we need to be prudential. We need to be careful. But we can afford that, let's say, as middle class, upper middle class people, but not everyone can do that. So those who cannot do that have to learn to live within their own communities. So neoliberalism is actually essentializing already existing communities, Islamic, religious, cultural communities. So there is no really passe out of here as long as we really call back the institutions of the welfare state, I would argue. And one final thing, Gülnaz, I mean, I'm coming from migration studies, but I'm always trying to demigrantize migrants, demigrantize migration. For a second, let's forget about identifying, let's say, these people through their ethno-national cultural, religious markers. Let's forget about that they're Muslims, they're Turks, they're this and that, they're Moroccans. Let's just concentrate on the features familiar with us. We all have the same concerns in everyday life, having a decent life, a retirement, sending our children to good schools, etc., etc. So in that sense, I think it's better to forget about this, migrant frames or religious frames, and it's better to concentrate on another frame. And I think the most important frame is, for me, majority and minority frame. And this takes me back to Henrik Ibsen from Norway, and Mark Twain from the United States, in so many different places and so many different times. They say something really interesting. They say that minorities are usually right, majorities are usually wrong. So this is really interesting. So we are actually exposed to the frames set up by the majorities. So minorities do not come out of the blue. They are constructed by certain individuals who share the same problems, the same socioeconomic, psychological, spatial problems. So we create the minorities, we create the Muslims, we create the Turks, we create the Kurds, we create the Moroccans. This is the problem of the majority. So we need to look at the majorities. We really need to problematize, or we need to start problematizing the majorities. We need to start our analysis by problematizing the majorities. This is what I argue over the last 30 years, so to speak.
One more
Sure.
comment. Building up a little bit on what you said, and another term that you used in your presentation on co-radicalisation, because I think it's again important to emphasize that it's not only that the two communities seem to exist on the opposite side, so it's not the status quo, but they're actually indeed feeding on each other, and then therefore there is sort of a downward spiral risk of indeed nativists using Muslims, which creates again the feeling of the Muslims that they do not belong, and that sort of again feeds the other way around. However, I would like to challenge you a little bit on this, because again, maybe some of the listeners here in the audience also know the case of a far-right politician from the PVV converting to Islam. Mm-hmm. In November, we had the elections, and again, in the news, there was a wave of messages that maybe Muslims have contributed to Wilders' victory. So again, these are more sort of, maybe you would say random, maybe so it's marginal, and again, you can also ask who is sending these messages. So I totally agree that you need to be critical. However, the question will be, do you think that there will be still possibility for convergence between the two groups? Because you were talking indeed the shared feeling about refugees, you also emphasized. Some of the identities, again, masculinity can be something that's shared across the groups and maybe different reasons. But do you see there is a possibility of actually ideological convergence, the groups that you would otherwise put on the two opposite sides?
Yeah, I don't really have a lot to say on that, but the problem of co-radicalization comes out of the fact that there is no dialogue between these groups of people. As I said earlier, back in 1990s, I did my PhD work in Berlin, in Kreuzberg, worked in the youth centers where there were a lot of young people with German background, with Turkish background, Muslim background, nationalist background, etc., etc. But they were communicating in one way or another. So they were not becoming violent. They were communicating on the dance stage through break dance, through hip hop, through graffiti. So they were, having their own symbols and communicating in the public space in aesthetic forms. Now we have radicalization and even extremism. It's mainly because of the fact that politics doesn't work. Mainstream politicians, mainstream political parties are not delivering enough to resolve the existing structural problems. On the contrary, they are doing the same. They are becoming more and more right-wing. They are becoming more and more populist because they believe that people appeal to those things. And of course, I also understand why people, individuals like us, are becoming more and more appealed to the past, to the heroisms, to the heritage, because we are really afraid of the present. We are really afraid of the future even more. But the conversion, I mean, Olivier Roy does a lot, work on the conversions, convert individuals, etc. For instance, what we see in the field that, I mean, it's going to be speculative a little bit, but he looks at the people recruited by ISIS, and then he finds in different contexts, in the European context as well as in the American context, majority of the people recruited by these organizations have nothing to do with Islam. They are not coming from an Islamic upbringing. They are not coming from this religious upbringing. They are mostly either converts or they had difficulties in their childhood, in their youth years, and introduced with Islam by these organizations, organized entities, to offer them another world is possible, So I think there's not a problem with religion. Religion is there. Religion has always been there. So here I think the problem is really, for some, radicalization is becoming Islamized because it's really attractive for so many people since counter-hegemonic discourses are no longer handled by the left-wing political parties or organizations, so to speak.
Okay, I now also would like to open up for engagement with the audience. Just one remark, please use the microphone to ask your question for the listeners online, so otherwise they will not be able to hear you talk. But if there are any questions in relation to the lecture or the discussion that follows, feel free to ask. I see one at the back, and then it will move to you at the front.
My question is related to one of your slides in which you stated that you prefer the term Islamophobism instead of Islamophobia. And I'm curious whether you choose the phobism because it ends with a postfix ism, and it therefore is an ideology, and it therefore is a governance strategy to, for example, consider anything that the Palestinians do. It's not about Palestinians, but it's about Muslims. It's a war of the Muslim against the Jewish, basically.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say a few more words about this term that I coined myself. Well, Islamophobia to me sounds a bit problematic because there is phobia in it. And it has the risk of naturalizing the hatred, the fear against, let's say, Muslims, against human beings, basically. We may have phobia against the heights, against certain insects, against certain things, but I don't understand why do we have to have phobia against human beings, right? So that is why I think it's a problematic word. So I instead use the term Islamophobism exactly because I think it's a very neoliberal form of governmentality in Foucauldian sense. Maybe it is not really an ideology as such because there is this thin-centered ideologies and really hard core ideologies. Islamophobism is not something like that. It is like populism. It is like nationalism. It goes with the left-wing people. It goes with right-wing people. It's a form of governmentality because it teaches individuals, it shows individuals that simply Muslims are there, minorities are there, to put the blame on and to really appeal to it, because Islamophobism is really the main channel at the moment, the main tool at the moment, or the main form of governmentality, which makes it possible for the right-wing populist parties to mainstream themselves. This is what Wilders did. This is what AfD did. Because previously, these extreme right-wing political parties were simply racist. They were not really having any welfarist policies. They were not having anything as such. And they were mostly supported by working class people mainly. But recently, because of the prevalence of Islamophobism, used by right-wing populist parties very successfully in their communication strategies, even the LGBTI people have become parts of these, supporters of these parties, at least some of them. Even middle-class women and men have become supporters of these parties. So Islamophobism is very handy since 9/11 for such anti-systemic political parties to mainstream themselves. And one thing more, for me, Islamophobism of today is a bit similar to anti-Semitism of the late 19th century. Late 19th century. I'm not comparing Islamophobism of today with, let's say, the time of Holocaust. This is not comparable. But Europe is unfortunately, on average, becoming more and more culturally Christian, not religiously Christian, but culturally Christian because of the prevalence of this Islamophobism. So I think there we need to be careful. This is Rogers Brubaker also underlining this, Europe becoming culturally more and more Christian because of this prevalence of Islamophobism. So this is what I think. Thank you.
We had one more question at the front. And please just raise your hand so that I can.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I had some questions because when I was listening about this whole history, you know, from the 70s, 80s, you're not talking about women, Muslims, Islam, and against women. And if we are talking in Europe, I mean, I'm a European woman, and from the 70s, 80s, we had so much freedom, we were getting into another world, and then the Muslims came. Well, in the beginning it was no problem, because even in Turkey there was not such a headscarf item. Maybe in Morocco it's a different problem. But now, if you're talking about Islam, you're talking about religion, and everything with Islam is religion, and we are going down in religion. So I think that's a very big problem to accept Muslims for women, because we don't want to get in this kind of world. And then the second thing I was thinking about, like in France, you have a laïc social, there is a difference between religion and states, which makes it in one way more easy, because it's immediately no discussion. Of course, there are a lot of problems in France with their countries where they were used to be very powerful. I'm not going to count them all, but I think there is something I missed in your discussion.
Thank you very much. This is a very good question. Well, I mostly agree with you in the things that you have raised, but I brought this historicist approach because I think historicist approach is something that we really need nowadays, especially since we are becoming more and more forgetful about everything. You know, we are exposed to a bombardment of information in order to tackle with those incoming information, we really need to forget about the things that we learned in the past. This is what we call the age of amnesia. We're all becoming really amnesiac in a way. But then going back to 1970s, if you look at, let's say, Islam, it's not really something homogeneous at all. It's very heterogeneous. It's very diverse. So it's like Christianity in a way. So there are different paths. There are different ways. So specifically, let's say, talk about Sunni Islam, right? Sunni Islam is really, rhetorically speaking, is a rather democratic religion. Because Sunni Islam, rhetorically speaking, doesn't accept any cleric, any mediator between God and individual prayer. So that's what the book says. That's what the religion says rhetorically. But we know in reality that is not the case. We know that in Sunni Islam there is the clerical class. We know that Erdogan is very important, for instance. We know Diyanet in the Turkish context as well as in the European context is very important. We know the Moroccan king is very important in the kind of religion, that official religion that he wants to promote. So then this brings us to the institutionalization of Islam, which is a totally different phenomenon. Because when Islam is becoming institutionalized, then the problem starts. But then institutionalization of Islam is not only happening because of the clerics, newly emerging clerics, fighting against the, let's say, laïcité or secularism, because they have their own vested interest in the institutionalization of Islam, Sunni Islam. But then let's also not forget about the fact that institutionalization of Islam in the Dutch context, for instance, has also something to do with the Dutch state, has also something to do with the pillar system. Pillar system, because when the, let's say, Turks or Moroccans came to this country back in the 1960s, they had a ready system, pillar system, which offered them to have all these channels to institutionalize their religion in mosques, in imams, in this and that. So I always argue that there is a really paradoxical relationship between individualization of Islam, which we have seen back in the 2000s in the Netherlands, in Germany, among these young people on the one hand, but on the other hand, the paradox between individualization of Islam and the institutionalization of Islam. So, I mean, there is a really long answer to your question, because it is not only about, let's say, Turkey, Morocco, it's not only about Islam per se, but it's also about the Dutch state, about the French state, about the German state, because they actually did not really offer any opportunity structures to these people who came here in 1960s, and they gave everything about their faith to the Turkish state, to the Moroccan state, to the Algerian state, to the Egyptian state. And they, of course, tended to use religion as an ideology to reach out to their people. And then we have seen Erdogan and his ministers coming to this country during elections over the last few years, causing a lot of trouble, creating a lot of tension between the locals and the Muslims. So this is why I think there is a problem with the ways in which European states have so far institutionalized Islam or accommodated Islam. We need to really work on that. And the other things, laïcité, you're of course right. For instance, I mean, laïcité really an interesting case for the French. Laïcité is being used by Le Pen to be rather implicitly Islamophobist, but not explicitly Islamophobist. So Le Pen is using laïcité for her own purposes, and we have seen in the interviews that these purposes the people see, the self-identified Muslim people see, and they find it problematic, because they know that she's not really laïque, because laïcism is a great ideology, actually. Laïcité is a great ideology, because laïcité is coming from the word lay people. So the French laic state presumably finds no problem with the Catholics, with religion. What the laic state is telling us, that laic state is against the instrumentalization of the Catholic religion by the Catholic Church, who have a vested interest in the continuation of this core religion, right? So the same goes with the Turkish case. Kemalist laicite was not against Islam. Kemalist laicite was simply trying to formulate a country, a state, in which Islam should not be instrumentalized by any cleric, ulema, for their own interests. And now what is happening in Turkey is that Islam is being instrumentalized by Erdogan and his entourage for their own interests. It has nothing to do with Islam. So this is the thing that I'm trying to underline. Thank you.
We are moving through time, but I want to give a last round if there's some more questions that I can gather, so different ones that I can convey. I see one hand at the back, two hands at the back. So we will just gather the different questions if some others have something they would like to ask.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. I was wondering why you think it is specifically the Islam which is Islamatizing radicalization. And secondly, as you responded to an earlier question or comment, why you're saying that Europe is becoming more Christianized. Do you mean Christian values? Because I feel like religion or Christianity is rather decreasing in its importance nowadays instead of increasing. And then finally, coming back to my first point, regarding Islamophobism in Europe, why do you think that is? Do you think it has something to do with maybe potentially because of globalization, the increase or popularity of organizations like you mentioned, ISIS, and their maybe aim of creating fear in Europe? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And there was another question. Yes.
I hope this is going to come across somewhat sensibly and not just rambling. Something that strikes me as a very big difference between the types of radicalization we're talking about is that one of them, which you've alluded to, has a path to electoral mainstreamness and one of them currently doesn't. If we want to talk about governmentalities, about response to radicalization, the response to Islamic radicalization in the past decade especially has been very, very different in terms of the willingness to use state power to surveil, to attack, however you want to put it. And to me that comes back to the question you put at the start about this notion of non-violent radicalism. Because if I look at, you use the example of the Germans seeing foreigners out. For me, that is a very different spectacle when you have a political movement capable of saying, yes, we can do that. Yes, let's get rid of foreigners. Because then the implicit violence of that is becoming much less implicit. If you are a foreigner hearing that song, you are not, for me at least, that is a form of violence. Or at the very least, the potential for violence in the future. And I wonder if you can maybe speak to that, this idea that this is fine, this is just self-expression. We want them to express themselves more. When that form of expression, for me, gets us into very problematic territory when it's married with what is fast becoming a politically mainstream movement.
Thank you very much. These are all great questions. The first set of questions, Islamophobism is handy for right-wing populist parties, but also right-wing mainstream political parties. Islamophobism is nothing new. I will take you back to early 2000s when Angela Merkel and Sarkozy and David Cameron bashed multiculturalism, bashed Islam as well, or anyone coming from Islamic religion. So this has been with us for several actually decades. So this is why Islamophobism has become a common kind of form of governmentality across Europe. And this is why, since 9/11 especially, Islam has become the source of fear to be used by Christian democratic parties in the 2000s, by conservative parties in those years, and now by the right-wing populist parties. So this is, a kind of politics of fear that we are all familiar with. In the end of the day, even the right-wing populist parties are catch-all political parties. They want to appeal to everyone, right? So nowadays, since the actually 1990s, since the war in the Balkans, since the time when Huntington coined the term clash of civilizations, we are living in the same political climate. And this climate is telling us that, or hinting us that, let's say, Muslims and Christians cannot live together. Well, this wasn't the case for so many centuries. What happened that Christians or Muslims started to kill each other in the 1990s in the Balkans, and then why all of a sudden Huntington coined this term? As a social scientist, I always presume that no root cause of any problem that we are having in our everyday life can be religion related, can be ethnic related, can be cultural related. All the questions that we are having now at the moment are socioeconomic in nature, are political in nature. So it is the civilizational paradigm which has made it possible for the organized right-wing political parties to use religion, to use Islam for their own sake. Nowadays, the right-wing, let's say, populist parties in Europe are becoming more and more Islamophobist. But on the other hand, there are some political parties here as well, DENK, Justice and Development Party in Turkey. They are becoming more and more, Islamist. So it is the common thing, because, as I said earlier, this is the time when ultra politics operates. So we need to find ways to go back to that proper politics. So we need to really invest in institutions. We need to make them work if they are not working. So the other thing is, we need to learn a lot actually from these right-wing populist parties, because they're really good at communicating their message with the people through social media, through TikTok, through Facebook, I don't know what, right? So the problem is not really those parties, I tell you. The problem is the mainstream political parties, which did not deliver, which did not do their homework for decades. This is why people are becoming more and more anti-systemic. Right-wing populism is an outcome, is a symptom of already existing problems. Islamism is an outcome of already existing problems. When you look at the Turkish context, for instance, why we have Islamism? Well, it's because malfunctioning former Kemalist regime, right? So this is all dialectical. This is the way my mind operates in answering the kind of questions that you asked. And about the second question, yes, of course, you're absolutely right. This is again something to do with reaching out to those people. Those people are becoming anti-systemic and anti-systemic and outspoken in their stance through songs, through this and that, different forms of radicalisms, because there is not really a political will to really try to listen to them in the first place, accommodate them, and make them a bit more careful in their outspoken words and terminologies. They have become more outspoken because of the absence of such political will at the moment. So that's why we need the left. That's why these mainstream political parties, I mean, I've seen the billboard of the German SPD recently, Deutschland, den Deutschen, so the Germany of the Germans. Can you imagine a social democratic party is using exactly the same kind of rhetoric that is being used by the AfD? Of course, the content might be different, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Sure.
Just use the mic. If you, it's fine.
It's open, I think.
Hello? Yeah. Okay. You say on one hand that mainstream parties aren't listening, and yet on the other hand we have examples such as this from the SPD, but the mainstream right for years, if not decades at this point, has been listening and has been adapting their rhetoric, their policies. So what does listening look like if not that?
Listening, for me, is to find remedies to the problems of those people who have been suffering from the ongoing processes of deindustrialization in many European cities, small towns, remote places, right? Listening means, forgetting about this rhetoric of the European Union about unity in diversity. Listening means you need to find ways to console these people who have fears about the distortion of their homogeneous, way of life. We are all cosmopolitan people, I assume, in this place. We are the winners of globalization in a way. We are mobile people, but let's not forget about the fact that 95% of the world population is not really truly mobile. So apparently, I mean, there is this dichotomy between the cosmopolitans, I would say 5%, 7% of the world population, and 93% localist, parochial, particularist people. So this is what I mean by listening. So that's why I think the problem is really, I believe, is the mainstream political parties who have already created these discourses that are being used by the right-wing populist parties. I've been working on multiculturalism for 3 decades. I can tell you how the story goes in Germany. In the Netherlands, the land of tolerance has become the land of intolerance. Why is that? Right? Because tolerance, you know what the term tolerance means etymologically? The equivalent word for tolerance is to suffer. Tolerance comes from tolerer, Latin word tolerar, which means actually to suffer. So we are actually learning to tolerate the one that we are originally suffering from, because the modern state is telling us to tolerate. So in the first place, we really need to work with these words that we have internalized. Hoşgörü in the Turkish context, tahammül, an Arabic word in the Turkish context. Armenians were known the most loyal segment of the Ottoman Empire. Why do you become so loyal to the state? A, either because you really adore the state, the Ottoman state. B, you're really afraid of that. So tolerance is also a term that was actually coined by the Ottomans in the Balkans back in the 14th century, which was later also borrowed by the Dutch, by the French, by the German, etc. To end the imperial, luxuriness to kill the Protestants in the Catholic France or the Catholic Spain simply because of their religious differences. So there is, of course, a positive aspect of tolerance, but we really need to work on our own vocabulary. Maybe instead of tolerance, we need to learn to respect, to recognize, to understand. So this is the kind of, so it all starts from us, basically. So let's not really look at the others, but let's start with ourselves. This is really what I think. Thank you.
That's kind of a nice note to end the entire session, which was indeed about a lot about changing gazes, changing labels, understanding context through different lenses, and so I've learned a lot. Thanks a lot, Ayhan, for your insight in the matter, and Gulnaz for your response. And thank you, audience, for being there. And yes, have a lovely evening. And I hope you are, a bit more wiser, even though things got more complexer, as they always do. Thanks a lot.